Now, the SNP continues to ride high in the polls, despite having increasingly divided internal factions, a vaccine rollout that lags somewhat behind its English counterpart, a generally uninspiring response to the pandemic. No worse, but not that much better than the London response. Crucial Holyrood elections in May could provide the SNP with the mandate they need for a second referendum. And the unionists are only just realising the scale of the task at hand. Douglas Ross is leader of the Scottish Conservatives. He's fighting to stop Nicola Sturgeon from getting the majority she wants. He joins me now. Douglas Ross, welcome to Spectator TV.
Delighted to join you.
You've been leading the Scottish Tories now for 6 months. When you took over, the Tories were polling on the constituency vote at 20%. They are now polling at 20%. You've made no impact.
Well, there was one poll this morning that actually had us up at 23% on the constituency, 21% on the list. But I'm looking at where we were at this stage 5 years ago. So in 2016, in the run-up to the Holyrood elections, we were polling at 15%. And we went into that election and stopped the SNP, who were on roughly similar figures as they are now, and we denied them that majority. So it shows it can be done, but the only party with the strength right across Scotland to do it is the Scottish Conservatives.
But, well, you say that, but looking at your own ratings, the favourability rating for Douglas Ross is 16%. The favourability rating for Nicola Sturgeon is 59%. I mean, there's quite a gap. Again, no real impact.
Well, it's really difficult at the moment when Nicola Sturgeon is on the BBC every day doing a daily briefing rather than addressing Parliament, as I think people would expect the First Minister to make her statements to Parliament. And I think there's ongoing discussions with the BBC at how they have allowed the First Minister to politicise, in many cases, these daily briefings, and giving her, you know, a very strong platform which other opposition parties don't receive.
But I'm still puzzled as to why you've not really made any cut through. I mean, the SNP thinks it's had a good pandemic, but the figures suggest it hasn't really handled it that differently from the Tories in England. The vaccine rollout has definitely been slower than England. There have been years of dismal results under the SNP now on education and in health. There are many inquiries going on into the Scottish government and the First Minister. There's a civil war now raging in the SNP for everything from independence strategy to gender identity. I mean, if you can't cut through amid all that, when are you ever going to cut through?
Well, there's a lot in that question, so let's just look at various different points. First of all, on this perception that Nicola Sturgeon has handled this pandemic any differently or better than the rest of the UK, I think you're right to call out, because we have had problems and failures in Scotland the same as across the UK, and the figures don't suggest it's been any better handled by Nicola Sturgeon. Indeed, we had the shocking case last year where people that had tested positive in hospital were then released into care homes, and that was as a result of SNP Scottish Government advice and guidance. And indeed, when
so why aren't you, if that's true, why aren't you breaking through?
Well, here's the nub of it, Andrew, is when there is a vote in Parliament, when all the opposition parties say, actually, we need an inquiry into this as a result of these SNP failures, they fail to do that. They fail to respect Parliament. And indeed, we've seen that multiple times, that we can have a vote in Parliament, we can hold the SNP to account, and they simply ignore it. And that is unacceptable. And we do have this situation where there are a litany of failures in education, in health, in rebuilding our economy. There has been a sluggish approach to business and the economy here in Scotland long before COVID, and we've just got to keep hitting home these messages.
But why then are you stuck at 20% in the polls, or in the regional poll? You were around 16% in the Comres poll. I mean, if the SNP is as bad as you say it is in governing Scotland, it's certainly got a civil war going on at the moment, it doesn't seem that people are paying much attention to you.
Well, there is obviously a problem with getting cut through for politics at the moment. People are worried about their job. They're worried about their relatives or themselves getting COVID. They're worried about getting a vaccine. And it was right that the Scottish Conservatives led the charge against the SNP to get daily figures, so we knew how many people were being vaccinated. And that's why we knew early on in this process that Scotland was lagging behind the rest of the UK. Now, I'm pleased they've upped the ante and they've upped their efforts, but we are still, experiencing problems with the vaccine rollout here in Scotland. But to go back to your question, you're right to raise it. It's difficult to cut through at the moment when people are focused on this pandemic.
Boris Johnson described devolution as, quote, a disaster. You rejected that description, but there hasn't been an opinion poll in Scotland now for almost a year showing a majority in favour of the union. And that the one last March was only 51-49. I mean, pretty much statistically nip and tuck. I mean, if you are a unionist, in what way has devolution not been a disaster?
Well, I'm absolutely a unionist, and the Prime Minister clarified his remarks. Remember, this is a Prime Minister who got that top job because of devolution. His time as Mayor of London ensured he was in a position to then stand again for Parliament, to become Foreign Secretary, and ultimately to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So he understands and fully respects how devolution works. But like me, he's frustrated that after 14 years of devolution in the hands of the SNP in Scotland, we're seeing so many of our public services suffering.
And yet again, you have no chance of winning this election.
Well, we're a long way out. We've got to look at the opinion polls. As I say, look at how we are comparing now compared to where we were 5 years ago in this stage. If you'd been interviewing Ruth Davidson, you'd have been saying the exact same thing. You can't stop an SNP majority. And we did. We more than
Douglas Ross, we're talking about an administration in Edinburgh that's been in power for what? 14 years. And is odds-on favourite to be re-elected again, perhaps with an overall majority.
Well, we've got to see how the campaign goes. As I say, Andrew, if you'd been sat here 5 years ago, you'd have been saying to Ruth Davidson there was no chance that the Scottish Conservatives could have stopped the SNP having that majority. And they did. Many people forget this. But Nicola Sturgeon went into that election in 2016 with a majority and came out of it having lost the majority because the Scottish Conservatives more than doubled their number of MSPs.
If Nicola Sturgeon either gets an overall majority or is still clearly the dominant power in Holyrood and forms another government, and proceeds to hold a referendum without the agreement of Westminster, it's in the jargon, it's without a Section 30 order, what should the British government do?
Well, I know the Scottish Conservatives will take no part in a wildcat illegal referendum. I want to focus on Scotland's recovery after COVID rather than another referendum. That's where every political party should be aiming their strengths, their abilities and their, the might of government to make sure Scotland gets back up and running after COVID. But absolutely, I'm not going to take part in any wildcat illegal referendum, and it just shows where the SNP have got to. They just want a referendum over anything else, and they are not willing to focus on what needs to be done in Scotland over the next 5 years. They want to rip us apart from the rest of the United Kingdom, and even if that means holding an illegal referendum.
So just to be clear, under your leadership, the Scottish Tories would not participate in a referendum that was not sanctioned by the Section 30, and that you would encourage your voters or supporters to stay at home.
Yes, absolutely. Boycott it and show it for the reckless referendum it is. It's one that takes away attention and time from the real serious problems we have here in Scotland right now for our education system. The fact that the SNP are building hospitals that can't take any patients. The fact that our economy is struggling. The fact that our justice system seems to support the criminals more than the victims. These are where our focus has to be on recovery rather than a referendum, which, if it doesn't have that Section 30 order, then it is not the gold standard referendum that Nicola Sturgeon herself said the 2014 referendum was.
But if Nicola Sturgeon wins an overall majority and fights the election on a clear request for a mandate, to give her a mandate for a second referendum, and she gets an overall majority as a right, as a result, by what right do you have to refuse of that second referendum?
The fact that we were told just over 6 years ago that the 2014 referendum was a a once-in-a-generation vote that had been accepted by both sides as the gold standard. That's how you agree for the UK government to give the Section 30 order, to agree the date, the question, all of this. Yet now Nicola Sturgeon wants to rip that up and appease her nationalist supporters and say she would have a wildcat illegal referendum anyway. What does that say to people up and down Scotland right now who are worried about their job, worried about their school for their son or daughter, worried about their health service for their family who can't get into these hospitals that the SNP build that can't take any patients? It just shows that Nicola Sturgeon's priority is to the SNP, not to the Scottish people.
But in the 2014 referendum, the Unionist side, your side, told Scottish voters that the one sure way to secure Scotland's continued participation in the European Union was to vote to remain in the United Kingdom. How did that work out?
And then the United Kingdom had a democratic vote, one that was agreed by Parliament, supported by politicians, to ask the public if they wanted to leave or remain in the European Union. That is how you deal with these referendums. You go through a process which is clear in law.
But you never mentioned that in 2014. In 2014, when the SNP campaigned on leaving the UK, but joining the EU as an independent member, your side said, there's no guarantee the EU will accept you. The only sure way you can remain in the EU is to stay in the UK. And that turned out to be a fundamentally wrong statement to the Scottish voters.
Well, the Scottish voters also knew there was an opportunity, if the Conservatives won a majority in the election the following year, that it could be a manifesto commitment to have an in-out referendum on our place in Europe. But then let's also look at what the SNP told the people of Scotland. If you vote for independence, we'll pay for everything with oil at over $100 a barrel. Well, oil hasn't been over $100 a barrel at any point since that 2014 referendum, and that was certainly a misleading statement from the SNP, just one of many.
When we got on to this part of our interview, my original question to you was, what do you think, or how would you advise the government in London to prevent or respond to a wildcat referendum? What's the answer?
Well, I assume the government in London would look at what the Scottish Conservatives are doing, and under my leadership, I'm saying boycott it. Don't get into this fight with the SNP over a wildcat referendum that distracts from the UK government, Scottish Conservatives, and what I think every political party in Scotland and across the UK should be focused on over this next 5-year Parliament, which is recovery rather than referendums.
If it's a wildcat, or some would call it, I think probably you, Douglas Ross, would call it an illegal referendum, should Police Scotland, local authorities, returning officers, should they participate in the administration of such a referendum?
Well, there's two other people to mention before it even gets there, Andrew. What about the Lord Advocate, who is appointed by the government? So if Nicola Sturgeon is still the First Minister and taking this through, her political appointment as the Lord Advocate in a neutral way, but he is still appointed by the First Minister, must give advice to the First Minister and say this is out with the remit and the authority of the Scottish Parliament. And then the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, before any vote is held on an illegal wildcat referendum, should be saying this is out with the remit of the Scottish Parliament. How about Nicola Sturgeon? You deal with education, with health, with policing. They're all within your remit. Focus on them rather than this wildcat illegal referendum.
So if Scottish ministers, government ministers, proceed with what in your view would be an illegal wildcat, your words, referendum, should they face criminal charges?
Well, they have to be answerable for their actions. Why are they taking forward these plans, illegal wildcat referendum plans, in the middle of a pandemic, when not only we are still trying to get on top of the health emergency, we will have an economic emergency to fight in the next few months and years ahead.
So just for clarification, whatever the outcome of the Holyrood elections in May, Scottish Tories will oppose a second independent referendum under any circumstances during the next session of the Parliament.
Absolutely. I don't want another divisive referendum, and people know that across Scotland, the Scottish Conservatives are the strongest party to stand up for their interests, for Scotland to remain an important part of the United Kingdom, to benefit from being part of that family of four nations, and to give so much to our four nations of the United Kingdom.
The traditional response to the SNP's demand for independence or a referendum has been to grant more powers to the Holyrood Parliament. Are you in favour of that?
I'd just love to see the Holyrood Parliament using the powers it's currently got. You know, they jumped up and down and called for more powers over social security, and then the SNP found they didn't have the capacity to deal with that, and they transferred them back to Westminster and the UK government to handle for a number of years. So let's see the Scottish government actually using the powers it's got right now.
So just to be clear, you would oppose any more powers for the Scottish Parliament for the moment?
Right now, I want to see the Scottish Parliament using the powers it's got.
Are you worried? I mean, the problems the Labour Party has had in Scotland in recent years has allowed the Scottish Tories to become the second party. And in some ways, the unionist vote has coalesced around the Scottish Tories. But there could be signs with a new leader that the Labour Party will be getting its act together. Maybe not in time for the Holyrood elections, or maybe it will be in time. Are you worried that they could supplant you as the main opposition to the SNP?
Well, I don't think they are in opposition to the SNP, and that's the problem. Under their former leader, Richard Leonard, I offered to work with him to say, look, if we can work together after the next election to get rid of this tired and failing SNP government, will you do it? And he said no. So I then made the offer to Monica Lennon and Anna Sawar when they announced they were standing for Labour leader, and they turned that down as well. So they don't want to work with other parties who support Scotland's place in the Union, who will stand up for Scotland to get rid of the SNP. And in fact, we see in councils across Scotland, they're actually perfectly happy to work with the SNP. So I think it's clear to people that the Labour Party are still stuck in this middle ground, and they're more likely to side with the nationalists and keep them in power than work with a pro-union party to get rid of the SNP.
But the May elections for Holyrood will be the first real test of your leadership. If you end up in third place, if Labour does become second, because we're all assuming the SNP will be first, if you're in third place, that will be a serious blow to your leadership, won't it?
Well, I'm not putting a limit on my ambitions for the Scottish Conservatives in this election, and I'm up for this fight. I'm really excited about the positive policies we're going to bring forward to take to people across the country and show the failures of this SNP government, and indeed the failures of parties like Labour who are not willing to stand up and be counted here.
But if you came third behind the SNP and Labour, that would be a problem for you.
I'm not going to predict where I'm going to come, Andrew, but I'm sure I'll be quite happy to come on again and discuss the results on Spectator TV once the people of Scotland have cast their votes and we know the outcome.
Oh, Douglas Ross, we'll hold you to that. Thank you for the promise, and thank you for joining us on Spectator TV on the week in 60 minutes. The leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross.